Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about scalability. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how is the scalability of a software architecture evaluated? Well, uh, usually it comes down to whatever value system or current literature a set of architects, or well, it depends really on who's going to say or do what. Whoever is in charge is usually the one who does the evaluation, and everybody does it sort of a little bit differently. This is usually where I say that a a person who understands this is where a person who truly knows how to get things done will stand out from the people who don't really know what they're doing, uh, or the talkers. The problem usually for the company is that it's going to be too late when they figure out which one is which. So depending on where you work, or depending on what sort of company you're dealing with, you will probably start to, I think you will start to notice a pattern before your career is done. And that is that you usually have two types of architects. You have, or like at the higher levels of software development, you have people who do the presentations, practically like all of like they facilitate meetings and they do a lot of presentations and they talk about practices, they talk about empowering teams, removing roadblocks, autonomy. They basically pick up whatever flavor of the month terms that you might hear about. And then you have the other category of developers who have like the real so-called like real seniors, who usually don't make as much of a splash, like they don't really talk about things or so forth, but they usually execute. They make things happen, or they design systems, or they build and code and so forth well into the later stages of their career. And so when you evaluate the scalability of the software system, it really comes down to who is doing the evaluation, who is at what perspective are you looking at, and what type of person are you dealing with, because usually their value system is going to be a fairly strong reflection on how the end system then gets designed and what considerations you are going to put into your architecture. Because the problem with saying, like, how do I evaluate the scalability is that there's so many factors to it. For example, scalability can be about performance. Scalability can be about security. Scalability can be about velocity. How fast can you develop? And that's like just velocity in of itself can mean many things as well, like how fast can you ship a specific feature for an individual team? Can you scale that up to multiple teams? How long does it take for teams to collaborate, or like what's the dependencies between the teams? Because that also affects the net speed or the net velocity of your system. This is an enormously complicated problem with many aspects. All I can really tell you is sort of the way that I usually look at this sort of thing, and let's just stick to that, because there's like an entire industry, guys, of, as I said, people who will talk about this, who will give you every idea between here and the sun about how to do this. And then there are tons and tons of people who are just doing, as I said, the true seniors who like sit down and like make things. They may not necessarily be the best people for it, but they're going to start making an architecture. In many cases, you will find that a really large system, guys, doesn't have one master architect. You have departments of people, and in one department they are doing things things in one way, in another department they're doing things in another way, etc., because this is literally how complicated it is to scale a really large system. It's like, segmenting. It would be like, even take the government, for example. Like, you have different departments that deal with different things related to your society, because the society is so gigantic and complicated that you can't just have one master person, or like one little group of people who's going to be like involved in everything. It's way too complicated. The thing that I usually look at when I'm involved in making architecture is, first and foremost, I usually look at two things. First and foremost, I look at the dependencies or like the ownership model of whatever we're doing, because ownership is, as I tell people, I've told people this many times, talent doesn't scale. And the fundamental truth about that is that if you have the idea that it doesn't matter who owns what, or if you just take a unit of a software developer and put them on a project, then you're screwed from the beginning. It's similar to if you force a person to do a job they don't want to do, they're going to do a shitty job, even if they might be very, very good at it. Like one silly analogy is that let's imagine taking Linus Torvalds or Uncle Bob or someone like that and forcing them to just do CSS all day long. They might be able to do it, but it's probably not going to be something that they're all that, they don't really enjoy doing it, for example. Silly example, but I hope you get what I'm saying. And so the thing that I look at is the team's responsibility, the different product teams and the different products that we have, and what it actually means to be part of that team, and what it means, how dependent people are on that team. Because if you have a service or a product within the system that has a lot of stakeholders where a lot of people need it, it's important that you consider that when you hire for that team. It's also important for you to think about that within the architecture, because the ideal state that you want to achieve is for maximum autonomy and collaboration between the different dependents. Because if you don't do that, then the velocity thing becomes a problem. Most companies care mostly about velocity of development and stability of the system. That you can basically take to the bank usually. Which means that if you want the velocity to be maintained, you need to make sure that people can work autonomously, or at the very least collaborate very closely with the people that they are dependent on. Because if you have one team that basically connects to everybody else, then they're not going to have time to help everybody else with all the things that they might need. And that means that you have to design the system for maximum autonomy. So things that, say, the team is doing, you have to think about, maybe you can automate some of it, maybe you can make self-service solutions where you don't have to wait for people to say, send a ticket and all of this stuff that happens right when you don't really have the autonomy that you need within the different systems. So that's number one, because that affects the entire velocity, it affects how effective people are going to be, and it affects in many cases how happy people are going to be. You can take this to the bank. The number one complaint basically in every single company I've ever been when it comes to developers, unhappiness and so forth, is dependencies. And I think that that's true for most of our industry. People hate sitting around waiting for other people to do stuff for them when it's not really working. Second thing I look for is the segmentation of the domain. In other words, do you have clearly defined domains, and what functionality lives in what domain? The reason why I do that is because that is something that's very critical to keep the overall architecture simple, but it's also something very critical for when you want to deal with things, let's say data architecture, or if you want to remove having a team, for example, creating a super service or something like that has a lot of arbitrary logic. Because one of the things that can very quickly happen if you don't have a clear domain of responsibility and what piece takes care of what part of this overall delivery process that you have, or all the different features, is that what can happen when big companies acquire smaller companies. You buy some third-party system that is designed without any real or any holistic thinking around the system that you have, and now you need to make those things work together, and all of a sudden you have these two different monolithic systems that are just trying to patch together integrations and sort of figure out who's going to be responsible for what. And very quickly you find a very nesty, very spider webby dependency graph of different functions going around, and all of a sudden the architecture becomes very difficult for you to maintain. And you find out very quickly when this is happening, when basic features, basic functionality, where it literally becomes easier for you to make the users compromise their user experience, and staff and people working at your company have to be trained to do things in a certain way, because the system is so shittily designed, or the segmentation has gone so poorly that you can literally not do basic things like searching, sorting data, or just getting an overview of what's going on in the system. You can't do that because the systems are so fragmented that they don't have a clear purpose. They do a little bit of everything, all of them, and that means that you can't centralize responsibility in any one area. That's a very important part in order to create a scalable system. It's the same thing you do in a regular application, guys, where you create modules like a user area or a product area or a customer area, like whatever, right? But if you don't do that, all of a sudden all your files are living in the same space, and you mix like user logic together with product logic in the same class or stuff like that, and all of a sudden it's like super hard to know who's doing what's going on. So what I want you to take away from this is that scalability in software architecture, you will have as many questions and like answers to this as there are people who are working with this, because there's no objective way. There are tons of frameworks for it if you want to talk about that, but I always found the same thing. It really comes down to the experience and the value system of whoever's doing the evaluation. And usually that's more than one person who is looking at this when you're dealing with really large systems. The thing that I personally usually look at, if we ignore like performance and these obvious things that are like hard requirements, is number one, I look at the ownership models of the systems, because it's extremely important that the different areas that do different parts of whatever workflow we're dealing with, that I understand how the business works, basically, because the software architecture and the business, they're always coupled, like they are always a reflection of each other. And that means that the teams that are dependent on other teams need to be as autonomous as possible, and they need to collaborate well with the teams or be co-located feature-wise, so that they sort of have a priority system that favors each other when they work, so that they can unblock each other as much as possible. Because the worst thing that can happen for company happiness is when people can't really get what they need in a timely manner, and they're always blocked by something. That is a major bottleneck in any organization. The other thing I look at is the segmentation of domains and responsibilities, because it's extremely important that you don't create these sort of super systems here and there that do like literally everything, and everything becomes a question of how do we fit in yet another thing into this super system, because very quickly you will see that it's very difficult for you to scale any one part of your organization, and in many cases you will have fragmented data. You will have like people coming with suggestions like creating a nicer API on top of all these ugly services, and then you try to like abstract away how these things are working, and that never works. That's why a clean architecture where you have different systems that take responsibility for very clearly segmented areas of your domain is a very good investment to make. And that's why I try to look at those sort of things, like who is responsible for what, as early on as possible, because that's going to set the tone for what everything else needs in the future. Like as I said with the API, you can put an API on a bunch of old, really ugly systems, but that doesn't change the fact that they are working in a certain way, and you know that things are not going so well with this problem when you see that basic things such as searching, for example, or the sorting data, or getting things in, like if you have synchronization issues, or like you don't know if this data is new or old, or if it's reliable or not, all those uncertainties, that's what's going to happen when you just do that. Because even if you create a nice interface on top of it, the logic is still the same. You can put a nice coat of paint on a badly made car, for example, but it's still going to be a badly made car. So if you need it to perform at a higher level, a coat of paint is not going to help. Have a great day.